And that leads us neatly on to our next session, which is about proposals for food governance and reporting. This is my happy place. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a food governance nerd. I would love to introduce you to Chair Professor Mike Rayner, and ask, who is also Chair of Sustain, and he will introduce the speakers within this panel. Thank you very much. Once again, Mike, I'll come back at you with a hooter if needed.
Thank you, Kath, and thank you so much for inviting me to chair this session. It's a subject very dear to my heart. I've been thinking, I've been calling for mandatory reporting of businesses for about 30 years now, but maybe the time's come. So I'm going to introduce to you Katie Pettifer from the Food Standards Agency, Paul Irwin-Rhodes from Greggs, Will Nicholson from the Food Foundation, and Kelly Parsons from the University of Hertfordshire. And as in the last session, you've got about 2 to 3 minutes. And it'd be great if you could keep to time, and then we'll have a general discussion at the end. And I'll try and keep an eye on the questions and the Q&A, and please put your questions in the Q&A as we go along. So firstly, Katie, would you like to say a bit about yourself as well?
Thanks, Mike. Yes, so I'm Katie Pettifer. I'm the Strategy Director at the Food Standards Agency. So we regulate the food system in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We're set up by Parliament, and our job and our objectives are set out in law. So the two big ones are to protect public health from food risks and to otherwise protect the interests of consumers in relation to food. We talk about our mission as being food, that people have food they can trust. And a lot of our specific functions are about making sure food's safe, and it's what it says it is. But you can't protect consumers' interests with thinking about the other big issues like health and sustainability. We've been doing a lot of thinking about what role we can play in helping there. And obviously Henry Dimbleby made some suggestions on that. And we really welcome the National Food Strategy because it was so good to see a system-wide report on this. I should say it's for ministers to decide how they respond to that report. We don't make government policy. But I did want to just mention 3 ways in which I think regulators like the FSA can help with tackling these challenges. The first is around looking at the consumer perspective. We do a lot of research on people's relationship with food, what drives it, all the factors, and it's really complex. For example, we know that the majority of people want to change their diets to make them more environmentally friendly, but 2/3 of those people think there are barriers. Cost is the biggest one, also just not knowing what environmentally sustainable is. And similar picture on healthy diets, but different barriers. And while most people think improving the health of their diet is the responsibility of the sort of individual, views are much more mixed on whose job it is to make it more sustainable. And then when you look at what people are worried about on food, cost comes out above both health and sustainability. So policymakers really need to understand the whole picture, and that's really relevant to the governance discussion here, I think, and why we need to join up policymaking across the system. Second area is data, both bringing it together and using its power to drive change. It enables us to properly inform consumers, enables you to set big targets and monitor progress, but it's more powerful than that because it drives change itself. Our food hygiene rating scheme, you know, the green and black stickers in the restaurant windows, we made that available as an API, and now the aggregator platforms like Just Eat are requiring businesses to have a certain rating before they let them on the platform. That's actually an incredibly powerful driver within the industry from data to drive change. So we completely support the idea of a cross-system data programme that the National Food Strategy suggested. It's a really big job, needs political leadership. I think there's also a role for a regulator in being a sort of data steward and design authority for it. And with any digital programme, you start small and you build out on that. And then the third thing I think regulators can do, and I'm coming to the end of my time, is to keep public trust in food high as new technologies emerge by really basing our decisions on science and evidence. I think that as a regulator, we really want to support the new technologies that could make a real difference in making the food production much more sustainable. But we need to do that really clearly based on the evidence so that people can use new food products and processes both safely and confidently. And I think protecting consumers is always going to be our #1 priority there. So I'm sure I've used my time, but I hope that informs the discussion we've got to come.
Great, thank you, Katie. Right, over to Paul Irwin-Rhodes from Greggs.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm Paul Irwin-Rhodes. I'm the head of sustainability at Greggs. Greggs, for anybody who knows us or doesn't know us, we're a UK-based out-of-home retailer. So we operate around about 2,200 stores across the UK, into Northern Ireland, around about 24,000 colleagues, and we're vertically integrated. So around about 60% of the goods that we sell within our stores, we make ourselves. From a mandatory labelling or a national food strategy point of view, so we engaged with Henry Dimbleby when he was on his strategy tour to talk to him about the impact that organisations, so food manufacturers such as Greggs, could have in terms of helping shape that strategy. And we had a number of discussions in there around the importance of, following on from Katie's point there, around data. So around data, around measurements, and around having very clear and simple metrics that would apply to everybody to try and help inform the consumer or any other stakeholder in terms of the performance of those organisations. So we see that as a really key part of what, of the recommendations of the food strategy. And we see that for a number of reasons. So we see that because it helps create that level playing field. So it removes some of that mysticism, or, it creates, a simple way for the consumer, for anybody else, to understand the impact of that organisation. It drives innovation, and it highlights areas of focus and potential for cross-industry collaboration on areas where there's a real problem. And that works not only just from a healthy diet point of view, but across all 3 Ps within that sustainable piece, around looking after the people from a healthy diet, sustainable diet point of view, looking after planet, and then looking after the profit in terms of using organisations who are taking organisations who are doing things in the right way and making sure they stay sustainable, and those people who don't want to get on that bus very quickly get off or drop off. So we see that's a really key part. From Greg's point of view, again, it's great following on from Katie, because I can just sort of lean on some of the comments she made. So we are a data-driven organisation, so we engage with our consumer on a very regular basis, and we work on designing our product range to match what our consumer wants. But we also like to use nudge technique to try and drive them to a more healthier diet. So we've got a number of activities that we've got ongoing that sit under our Greggs Pledge, which is our sustainability strategy through to 2025 and beyond. One of them is to increase the healthier choices range within our overall product range to 30% of the overall range. But that talks about healthier products, so that's that people per element of the 3 Ps. But we're also looking at how we can improve the sustainability element of our product range. So this year we focused on Scope 3 emissions analysis, which, as you can imagine, we manage our carbon footprint very well from a Scope 1 and 2 point of view, and have done for a number of years. Scope 3 is huge, as it is for every other food retailer, and that's highlighted a couple of areas for us to focus on going forward. And you'll see some development of that in the future. We see the other elements of that national food strategy being, it's very hard to read that document and review those recommendations and not nod your head as you go through them one by one. And I think we've all been this, because we're all in the same sphere on this. I think we're all nodding at the same places. I just think it's the opportunities start now when we start to see some of that planning activity come from government. And I don't think I've used anywhere near my time. And as Nicholson will tell you, that's not a normal occasion. That's not a normal habit, as it will.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thank you for keeping to time. Will, do you want to say your piece?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Paul. I'll gobble up some of your seconds if that's all right. So I think in a way I'm building on a lot of the things that Katie and Paul have said. Just by way of introduction for anyone who don't know the Food Foundation, I run our work on healthy and sustainable food in terms of business transparency. So we do a lot of work with investors and government engagement on that. The Food Foundation, in a broader sense, has a focus that we want to change food policy and business practice to ensure that everyone can afford and access a healthy and sustainable diet. I guess the context of this conversation is around, a food bill and what it should include and why it's so important. And I think we're talking a lot about mandatory reporting, and that's what I'll focus on mainly. But what I would want to say is that we don't think a food bill should just be about mandatory reporting. We see a food bill as being an umbrella mechanism for making sure a lot of the really important things that we want that need to happen actually do get passed into law. So that would include improved public procurement standards around food, and a food database that, to the point that Katie made. So the state of play in terms of reporting, this is one of the sort of speciality areas of mine, fortunately. So we've seen in the last few years an increase in transparency and commitments in the industry. So 5 supermarkets now report on or have targets for sales of healthy food. 2 are reporting on the sales split for animal and plant-based proteins. 2 supermarkets and 4 or 5 from the out-of-home sector have got targets around sales of veg, and more broadly across the industry, there's reporting on food waste. So from one argument, you could say, well, actually, that doesn't look too bad. However, these are the leaders. So this isn't the norm in the industry. These are the exceptional cases. And you don't have to dig very far into the industry to see that really it starts to run dry pretty quickly. Perhaps more importantly, there are differences in how all of these things are being reported and measured. So again, to Katie's point, that lack of consistency makes comparisons and even aggregation really, really difficult. That matters to the government. It matters to investors as well. So in a very real sense, where we are today, in a way, it's showing that the voluntary evolution of reporting isn't going to cut it. And we do need a mandatory standard that's consistent, that's meaningful, and that, I'm sure, as Paul from Greggs would agree, is reportable. Leading businesses, investors agree. Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Co-op, Waitrose, Greggs, to name a few, came out in public in July in support of this, as did investors representing £2.8 trillion in assets under management. And in fact, we're cooking up something bigger with investors on this at the moment, because we're very aware we're getting towards the business end of the government's commitment to respond through a white paper. So there's support for mandatory reporting. And I think if we miss the opportunity to incentivise change at this time, we might see it fade away a bit, as the businesses that are driving change actually find that they're putting their necks on the line a bit, whereas others are getting away with it by keeping their heads down. So to come back to a food bill, for mandatory reporting, it's complex. There's work to do to get the metrics right, but we kind of just need to get on with that and thrash it out and get it into legislation, preferably alongside public procurement and alongside the food database work that's always also been recommended by the National Food Strategy. I'll stop there.
That's great, thanks, Will. And lastly, Kelly Parsons from the University of Hertfordshire.
Hello, everyone. I'm a research fellow in the Food Systems Policy Research Group at the University of Hertfordshire, and I specialise in looking at food systems and sort of connections and coherence, and what kind of governance approaches can facilitate that. So my thoughts on governance and the National Food Strategy recommendations. Well, first point, it's really long overdue to address how food policy making can be made better. Been having calls for greater prioritisation and joined up policy for decades. So it's really hugely welcome in that the National Food Strategy is tackling that. And I think there's potentially could really have a massive impact on other countries who are all kind of grappling with what to do about this and what to do about their food systems, particularly in light of the Food Systems Summit. I think, like many other things, it does in a refreshing way. I think the National Food Strategy addresses governance in a really refreshing way. So it takes a sort of holistic systems kind of approach and proposes a package of measures: food bill, reports and plans, private sector and mandatory reporting, what work centres and data programme, expanding the FSA's role, and so on. So I think it's and I think this is really refreshing, because traditionally national food strategies tend to, one, spend more time on what they want to do and not really on how the policy making arrangements might be required to actually enable that to happen. And two, they tend to propose a single measure, like an advisory body or an interministerial committee, tend to be a bit sort of one-dimensional, whereas actually the needs are multidimensional, and everyone has their own ideas about what the pressing issues for, for governance and what the challenges are. But this is my top 10. So 1, food's not high enough on the political agenda. 2, short-termism. Governments change, ministers and civil servants change, food strategies come and go. Lack of coordination horizontally. So in my mapping research on who makes policy, food policy in England identified at least 16 departments, and there's no sort of oversight of the whole. Not coordinated vertically, national, local, or with the devolved. A lot of policies made by the private sector beyond the reach of government. Policies can be incoherent with one another and with our goals for a healthy and sustainable food system. Evidence is contested and fragmented, and data, that applies to data as well. Policy making is opaque. We don't know what's going on. We don't know which policies are live or whether they work or not, or who's advising on what often. There are multiple entry points for those outside government who want to engage, and there are limited voices advising and limited opportunity to participate beyond formal consultations. When you think about that list, the National Food Strategy utilises a range of different mechanisms which could fill a lot of those gaps. So monitoring, evidence, data, expanding the FSA's role, mandatory reporting. But I think most importantly, the food bill, I think, is really crucial for addressing political prioritisation, long-term approach, potentially monitoring and transparency, potentially coordination, coherence. I think it can tick a lot of boxes and overcome some of the mechanisms which can come and go, like advisory bodies, ministerial committees, food strategies, and so on. I think where I would say it might not fill some of the gaps, or where it could have gone further, is in terms of coordination and oversight of the whole. And I think there's a bit of a question mark about the FSA as the body that will deliver on that coordination, given what we know about governance approaches based on a department with its own remit, trying to kind of corral other departments to deliver. And I think in terms of participation, I think there's no real mechanism proposed, which I think for some is quite surprising, given it was such a participatory and inclusive development around the National Food Strategy. So there we go. Is that my time up, or can I say anything else? Or
no, thank you. That's great. Well, so questions. One of the biggest voted for question here is from Dan Crossley. How can we join up policy and hold UK government to account? I guess he means by that not just industry, but the UK government to account. Do we need something along the lines of the Climate Change Committee for Food Systems? And if not, what do you think we need? So can I just ask each of the panelists in turn? Katie, what do you think we need here? Is the Food Standards Agency going to be enough?
Well, it's not what we do at the moment, and the role Henry set out is a much kind of broader, looking across the system and reporting on progress role, which I think would be very helpful. It's up to the government to decide how it wants to set the system up to hold it to account ultimately, but we're often really conscious that we're the only body in the government space who's just thinking about food and food across the system, and everyone else who's coming to it has got a particular interest that are thinking about a bit of food as part of. I think there is a real benefit in having a forum where everything comes together just to look across the food system, and some external scrutiny and transparency on that. We're starting to produce an annual report now on the sort of state of play of the food sector ourselves and the areas that we do research on. And I think that there's benefit in that. The other thing is, I think there is benefit in general coordination more. So I think Will mentioned standards and what kind of metrics we use on data, something like eco-labelling. I think there needs to be a place where people come together and say, okay, what rules are we going to use? There is a real kind of convening role that could usefully be played. And you could see a body like that playing that kind of role.
Paul, what do you think?
I think it'd be, I mean, speaking from Greg's point of view, I think it would be very useful to have that body. I mean, in terms of our engagement across the areas that come out of the National Food Strategy, it's pan-governmental in as much as we probably speak to 6 or 7 different departments, and then within those departments we might be in discussions with 2 or 3 individual teams. So I think pulling all of those work streams into one place would be really, really helpful. And for just again, so Katie, honestly, I'm not doing the fanboy thing, but I think eco-labelling is a really good example of that. So we've got this pieces of information or pieces of discussion happening across the sphere. That needs to be a discussion in one place. And just on the wider labelling piece as well. So one of the concerns I always talk about within the businesses is, are we going to get to a point where we have a label that's bigger than the product? Because we'll have all of these labelling requirements and they come from different government departments. It's having that discussion in one place. We have something that, thinking from a consumer's point of view, he can pick that he can pick that food up and say, right, from a nutrition, from a sustainability point of view, I can see that's what I want to have. So I think that having a body like that would be very, very useful.
Okay, Will, what do you think? Do we need a climate change committee for food?
I'll be quick. So I'm going to interpret that through the lens of businesses and investors, just to give it some context. So businesses would rather have one place that they've got to report to. That makes a lot of sense. Investors would rather have one place where the data is available, and that would seem to make a lot of sense. How that gets disseminated into the decision-making parts of government is not really my area of expertise, but I do see that someone like FSA has this role where the standards are set, where the data collection happens, where the monitoring happens, and it can then be disseminated to those who are interested. I think one thing that's important when you look at UK CCC is to make sure it's publicly available, because then people like investors, people like NGOs can access the information as well. I think you're missing a trick if it's only information that's available to the government.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about the CCC is not just collecting the data, it's interpreting it as well. And I think that's an important function of any coordinating body. Kelly, but what do you think? I think this is the last question we're going to have to.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that I can see there's a lot of interest in kind of having an independent body rather than utilising an existing department. I mean, obviously, it's less politically costly to layer new responsibilities onto an existing agency than to create something new. So potentially that's why this has been, the National Food Strategy is a very politically astute document, I think. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen that come through. I think in an ideal world, some kind of independent body, which could, a scientific body, an advisory body, it could have lots of different shapes, but that could look at food as an overall, I think would be the ideal. But I mean, there are trade-offs between that. The CCC is a great model, and it has power to set targets and to chase up on those targets, but not necessarily to coordinate and corral what goes on inside government. So that's what I'm trying to say about having this kind of these different aspects that we're trying to cover. One body or one mechanism might not be able to do all of those things. So yes, I think there definitely could be some kind of food system committee, but we still need other things going on in order that wouldn't be able to solve all the problems. And just coming on to the point about the FSA, I think obviously expanding the FSA's remit back to closer to what it was when it was originally created does make sense in terms of bringing some of those issues around food into one place. But I wouldn't say that it would be the one-stop place for people to go for everything to do with the food system, because there's a lot of stuff that happens earlier on in the food chain that aren't the kind of remit of the FSA, and a lot of stakeholders down at that end of the chain would not be able to relate to the FSA in the same way as they would an independent body.
Thank you very much, all of you. I guess we've got about 30 seconds left, so I'm going to hand back to Kath.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I have written down and underlined, from Kelly particularly, political prioritisation, and also this whole concept within that discussion about the discussions needing to be in one place so that they aren't fragmented and sent in different directions. And also how important it is for those discussions about all those important things, whether it be assessment of technologies, assessment of new products, the labelling of it, the transparency, that how important it is that that is based on principles, is transparent, accountable, data-driven, and all of those things. Hence the need for legislation. I keep repeating it. We don't have those powers at the moment, and there isn't a body that will take those on. It is taken on piecemeal. It's given to the departments who will give the right answers, the right answers for whichever government is in power at the time. It isn't accountable to us as a population keen to see climate change addressed and obesity, child health, etc.